let's talk about it.
Yeah, thanks.
Have a seat. Actually, it's always interesting. We do all types of different events. So last week we had the event where it was Brazilians investing in real estate in the U.S., okay? Yesterday we had a very interesting discussion on education in Brazil and developmental thoughts, and now we have just investing in Brazilian real estate. And what's nice about doing that variety is that we get really a different crowd every time, different group of people kind of learning. In this case, again, investing in real estate in Brazil. Of course, the one thing I've learned in general about anything you do when it involves Brazil, you got to have a tax guy there, okay? And if anybody has a conclusion at the end, it's I got to talk to the tax guy before I do anything. So that'll be part of the discussion, but also clearly exchange rates, interest rates, the future of Brazil economically, all very critical. And we're really quite pleased and honored to have Otaviano Canuto here to lead off with the discussion. As you all know, a very distinguished and well-known representative for many years of the Brazilian economic scene. I want to thank Monica Vieira for helping put this together, and I think I will now just turn it over, though, to, should we go straight to, do you want to say anything, or do you want to go straight to?
No, let's Canuto.
Canuto, okay.
Yeah,
Canuto, it's all yours, okay?
But right there.
You have a presentation? No, presentation. Do you have slides?
No.
No, good. You're,
And their bios are here.
Okay.
All right.
Put the bios, yeah.
Good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Monica, for accepting this up. And I will try to be as brief as I can, so as to maximize the time that we have for our interaction, and also because we have two quite interesting presentations to be made as well. In a nutshell, if I could summarize what comes to my mind when I talk about Brazil the last few months. Brazil has been in the longest ever recovery period in Brazil history. It's been the deepest crisis when one gauged by GDP or by the evolution of employment in the labor market. To the point that several analysts start to allude to depression in Brazil, the Brazilian depression. And it's true, if one take into account, for instance, that last year, the third year after the end of the decline period, the GDP per capita was still close to 9% below the peak prior to the crisis. And the sluggish recovery on the real side of the economy is reflected in the low levels of employment generation over the period. So there's something really wrong with that. On the other hand, it's good. There's always a but. I'm a true believer that this time the path of policy implementation is something that is likely to generate, let's say, a steady growth period ahead. One that will not be as brilliant as it looked like over the first decade of this millennium, of this century, but nonetheless, one that is steadier and more stable, and with let's say, a higher degree of probability of maintenance and sustainability. So let me try to spell out a bit these two major takeaways that I highlight. I like to say, it's an image that, in my view, fits too well with what happened to Brazil and still ongoing. The Brazilian economy has been sick of a double malaise, a combination of anemia of productivity with obesity of the public sector. And the two diseases, they feed each other. If we take into account, for instance, sluggish performance of productivity, particularly the so-called total productivity factor, that is to say that productivity that goes beyond the simple increment of capital to labor and so on. The performance of productivity in Brazil has been mediocre, to say the least. Just to give an idea, when one takes off the contribution to growth of incorporation of labor into employment, informal employment, the total factor productivity has moved at a sluggish pace close to 0.2% per year, in some years recently even negative. So all that exuberant performance that we saw during the first decade of this century was maybe due to simply a shift in levels of formal employment, from a decrease in the levels of unemployment from 11% to 5%, made possible, among other reasons, because of the super cycle of commodity price, because at the same time that we had the super commodity price cycle, we also had a shift upwards in, we kept moving upwards the size of the public sector budget, and that made possible a almost falling from heaven a period of growth of GDP at an average rate of 4 to 4.5% over the first decade of the millennium. And what is quite interesting as well, with the bottom of the pyramid having its income rising at the Chinese pace of 7%. It was wonderful, but at the same time, from the standpoint of stability for macroeconomic performance and social performance, but at the same time, this was bound to finish, to end. This easy, relatively easy way of growing, delving into the commodity price and through domestic policies of either, it's not the issue of social transfer to Bolsa Família, because this is tiny. This corresponds to 0.5% of GDP, and that's the beauty of it. It's not expensive, 0.5% of GDP, and it yields a result in terms of lifting people out of misery that is fantastic. Not to speak of the school attendance and health attendance to the poor families. But it was, I'm referring to a period in which the increase in minimum wage, for instance, had primarily an impact, a positive impact on both employment and levels of income of workers. But as always happens with miracles, they function for a time and then they reach a condition in which they start to become a problem. And that's what happened after a certain point when there was a double down on this policy of minimum wage increase, much higher than the productivity increase, and this led to a crunch on profit margins of the manufacturing sector and so on. Okay, low productivity growth, which has to do, of course, with structural factors, the issue of low levels of education of the population. It's true that since the end of the last century, there has been a great improvement in terms of school attendance, school enrollment. When one breaks down the figures for according to different generations, it's amazing how the average schooling of the younger part of the population is way higher than their parents. But of course, the country still has a huge problem with the quality of this education. Not only that, there is the fact that the low levels of investment, of physical capital investment, for many reasons, low savings rates or the configuration of the income distribution in Brazil that is not necessarily friendly to investments and so on, and the levels of investment to GDP in Brazil have remained for now 3 decades, typically below 20% of GDP. You don't have to go very far to compare those. We don't need to go to Asia. It's suffice to compare with some of our Brazilian neighbors, and we'll have an idea of how low have been these investment ratios in Brazil. Particularly, and I go to an important point, investments in infrastructure, which have been below the minimum necessary to keep the existing infrastructure grid, which is, by the way, a precarious one. If it was precarious, it became even more as time passed by. Just to give an idea, the World Bank estimates a minimum of 3% of Brazil's GDP of investments in infrastructure just to keep it where it is. And we have not been able, in Brazil has not been able to invest even at levels above 2.5%. So Brazil has been eaten its already precarious infrastructure grid. And this has an impact on productivity, the waste. Just to give an idea, I was at the bank ready 2006 when we made a study on the Brazilian soybeans. And at the time, 2006, Brazil was already starting to challenge the #1 position of the West in soybeans, and in terms of production and export. And that was happened despite the fact that the lack of storage and transportation conditions was taking a toll of 30% of the Brazilian soybeans production. So if you have infrastructure in place, the productivity and the ability to compete would be even much higher than that. There is also weighing on the productivity, the absurdly bad Brazilian business environment. When I talk about Brazilian business environment, I mean everything that is there in between the company and the market and the economy as a whole. In you know, paying taxes, trading with the outside world, solving legal issues, hiring and firing, getting access to electric energy. This is the only item where Brazil does not perform so badly as compared to others. But in everything else, there is this burden, which ends up taking a toll from the companies. You have talented people, you have people, good lawyers. How many lawyers do we have here? All right, we have fantastic lawyers. Instead of doing something more, let's say, valuable, they spend their time in finding ways and dealing with the business environment. So this is a waste of human and material resources. On the other side, I get so enthusiastic sometimes that I will try to be as brief as I can. On the other side, you also had, for understandable and reasons, an increase in the public sector expenditure outlay. And that was due to the fact that the process of redemocratization entailed, through legal terms and through the public sector, a solution to the bad legacy, historical legacy in Brazil with the development of the pyramid, which is something to be praised. The problem is that this has not taken place without taking out benefits or in a privilege of the existing upper middle classes and so on. And this has reflected in public sector expenditures rising at the pace of 6% in real terms, above inflation, 6%, from 1994 to 2014. It's 6% in real terms per year after year. While GDP was growing at 4.5%, this only meant a light increase year after year of public spending on GDP. That moved it from 22% of GDP in 1994 to 34% in 2014. Well, when the sources of paying less growth, productivity less growth disappear, vanish, then this becomes, the mismatch becomes clear as all. It's true that the public sector spending as a share of GDP has remained stable since 2015, but even so, it's high while the rate of increase of the tax has not kept pace with it, and we have the country into an open fiscal crisis, as it has been the case. So that's why I call it obesity. And of course, one feeds the other, in the sense that the fiscal obesity means no space for investments, public investments in infrastructure, which feeds productivity, and also low productivity increase also mean that there is a mismatch between the will to increase public spending and the space that there is there when it comes to GDP. Now, this diagnosis has been pretty clear for some time. The issue is always to implement it. And what is the solution? The solution is obviously working on those dimensions that I said. Besides education, which is going to be something taking long, infrastructure, improvement in the regulatory framework, a review of the kind of public-private relationship that it exists before, improvement in business environment, and so on. And this has been, to a large extent, the agenda pursued by the governments that have succeeded Drummond. And the enthusiasm with the theme in the very beginning was not by chance. He came with the right directions and so on. The issue was himself and the scandals and the political paralysis that followed the JBS scandal and so on. But this path has been the one pre-announced and followed to a large extent by the new government on the economic policy side. We don't have, to some extent, to confound the so-called cultural agenda with the economic policy agenda. I will restrain myself to economic policy agenda, even though his stance, the president's stance on the Amazon, may backfire to a substantial part of the Brazilian productive sector. So the segmentation, unfortunately, cannot be complete, right? But setting that aside, it's not by chance that we saw that enthusiasm beginning of this year. Because everything is there, you know. We have to tackle first the fiscal obesity. A first step, important one, was the spending cap. I like to call the spending cap, the constitutional spending cap, as a straitjacket. You have a sick patient. With due respect, this is no obesity. I hope nobody feels. The way to deal with obesity is to put a straitjacket on the patient, so as to force it not to buy bad food. But of course, the problem with any straitjacket is that, you know, it doesn't suffice. You have to have a diet. You have something to make possible that the straitjacket is feasible. And that's where we have the outlay of consecutive reforms The first one, obviously, the pension reform, given the dynamics. Of course, the pension payments are one of those items that keep rising, no matter who's there in government. It could be PT, it could be PSDB, it could be Temer, it could be PMDB, it could be Bolsonaro. It's a ticking bomb that rises year after year. So the first step has been the substantial pension reform. Will that be enough? No. Particularly because the gains in terms of savings will be accrued only as time passes by. The next step is to curb, to stop, to review the public spending with wages. And that's why you have on the outlay of reforms, the administrative reform. Because the pay, the World Bank showed this clearly, there is a premium in terms of wages paid to public sector employees in Brazil vis-a-vis the private sector in equivalent functions. That makes Brazil an outstanding case vis-a-vis other emerging markets. So one may expect the government will have to change the law, so as to make possible the Supreme Court to accept actions in that regard, reduction of labor journeys, of working journeys, so as to reduce the pay. And there is also the issue of tax exemption, but that's going to take, let's say, further to be implemented. Another important item of the agenda is obviously the tax reform in order to, let's say, reduce the waste in Brazil associated with complying with tax functions. Another important item will certainly be as well, and then comes the privatization, which makes all sense, given that the scope of participation of public sector companies went way beyond their core functions over the recent past. And privatization is both a way to obtain, but we have someone here who has done a fantastic, superb job in analyzing the Brazilian space for privatizations. John Welsh over there. It's less for the money that it will provide to the government, to the revenues, and more to this efficiency seeking and opening of space for the private sector to spend money. So the challenge is, and I'm running to this, as of the very short term, aggregate demand conditions are not favorable, and that's why the economy has not been growing more steadily. And why is that? Because fiscal policy is retrenching, thankfully, and that's great because the spending cap being implemented. The households went through an artificial cycle. I mean artificial because it was funded, it was based on public debt issuance. And the boom of credit went to a bust. And we are in the middle of a transition. It's incredible how the retrenchment of public sector banking and credit is being replaced by a rising private sector bank-led credit, and particularly through the capital markets and debt instruments and so on. But obviously, you don't have a process such as this being automatically replaced. It's been taken, which is great news. So we couldn't have, both on the side of families, of households, or company funding and investment and so on, any, let's say, aggregate demand boosting process. But, and that's why I started with a 9% income gap as of today in idle capacity. On the other hand, provided that as the credit spreads have been showing, with the outlook of low interest rates and lowering credit spreads and so on, the Brazilian companies are even prepaying or at least replacing external debt with local credit, with inventories, conversibles, with domestically, which is a first. We will gradually have, this year is going to be a year in which the GDP will grow by something in close to 0.9%, which is not an outperformance after low growth rates over the last 2 years. But definitely it's poised to grow something in the range of 2 to 3% next year. I would call attention to the demand boosting effects of the FGTS, of the transfer of funds to the families. This one has a feature that makes it different from the Temer experience, because now it's geared at particularly the bottom of the pyramid, so there will be a boost to the consumption of non-durable. And if we take the transmission to consumption of what happened during the Temer government, the ongoing FGTS release will provide a 1 percentage point of boost in GDP that year. That's why I'm putting it between 2 to 3%. But the litmus test will be when the private sector decides to bet on the future. When the private sector decides to make investments, commitments that go beyond, let's say, catering to the current markets. That is when the confidence is strong enough to invest, for instance, to take the chance in infrastructure and other, let's say, heavier industry segments. That's where the litmus test of what's being promised as economic policy will be, let's say, said to be favorable or not. I must confess that unless there is any kind of political noise and questioning of the economic policy between now and the next elections, not only next year but 2022, that's the most likely path. I finished by remarking how those of you who accompany, we had such a turmoil in the Brazilian stock markets yesterday, the day before yesterday, Monday, with a simple rumor, unfounded one, that the Minister of Finance of Economy was about to leave, which gives us an idea of the dependence of all this that I was talking about on the maintenance of the policy that has been announced and pursued. And sorry for taking so long.